Whether you believe in the supernatural or not, death is a taboo subject matter that is generally difficult to talk about openly. Well, talking about death or an affliction in the context of real estate is no different. Whether death is a pertinent fact that must be disclosed to a potential buyer, when is it inconsequential and no requirement exists to voluntarily bring it up with your clients? This is one of those unique instances where superstition and real estate practice intersect. Well, fortunately, there are firm rules controlling this conduct. After watching this video, you will be able to determine when to disclose a prior death on a property and assess whether a history of death on a property might affect the buyer's valuation or desire to own the property or a tenant's desire to rent it. To illustrate when a prior occupant's use, affliction, or death are to be disclosed to a buyer or seller, let's go over a couple of examples. Consider a seller's agent who's located a buyer for the seller's real estate. Prior to making an offer, the seller's agent hands the buyer the seller's transfer disclosure statement. The transfer disclosure statement discloses the seller's and agent's knowledge about the present physical condition of the property. All other mandatory property and transaction disclosures are made. The buyer does not inquire into any deaths which might have occurred on the property. Ultimately, the buyer acquires and occupies the property. Later, the buyer is informed a prior occupant died on the property from AIDS more than 3 years before the buyer submitted their purchase offer. The buyer would not have purchased the property had they known about this event. The buyer discovers the seller's agent knew of the prior occupant's death on the property resulting from AIDS. The buyer claims the seller's agent breached their agency duties by failing to voluntarily disclose the death to the buyer. Now, did the seller's agent breach their general agency duty to the buyer by failing to disclose the death on the property occurring more than 3 years before the buyer submitted their offer? No. A seller's agent has no affirmative duty to voluntarily disclose information to a potential buyer regarding a prior occupant whose death from any cause occurred on the real estate more than 3 years prior to the purchase offer, or who was afflicted with the HIV virus or AIDS. Now, keep in mind, deaths on the property which occurred within 3 years of the offer are treated differently. Thus, when it comes to the disclosure of a death, you need to be aware of when it occurred, as different rules apply. Also, the buyers and sellers' agents do have an affirmative duty to disclose prior deaths regardless of when they occurred, when the death has an adverse effect on the property's market value. In this illustration, the fact the prior occupant had AIDS does not negatively affect property value. Also, though this discussion is framed in the context of a buyer and seller, be aware that it also applies to the conduct of a landlord and tenant. Regardless of whether a death occurred within 3 years of the buyer submitting a purchase offer, on direct inquiry by the buyer or their agent, the seller's agent is to disclose their knowledge of any deaths on the real estate. An intentional misrepresentation or concealment of a known fact after a buyer makes a direct inquiry is a breach of the seller's agent's general duty owed to the buyer to truthfully respond when the seller's agent represents the seller exclusively, or a breach of the buyer's agent's agency duty owed the buyer since the agent is the buyer's representative in the transaction. Further, an inquiry by the buyer into deaths indicates a death on the premises as a fact which might affect the buyer's use and enjoyment of the property. Thus, a death occurring on the property may elevate to the level of a material fact. On an inquiry into deaths by a buyer, an affirmative duty is imposed on a buyer's agent to either investigate the death or recommend an investigation by the buyer before an offer is made, unless the offer includes a further approval contingency on the subject of death. Note, this is the responsibility of the buyer's agent, not the seller's agent. The buyer's agent owes a fiduciary duty of care to the buyer.